for this session, I would like to present Associate Professor Practice Models, Head of Geotechnical Fluid and Materials Division of the University College London.
So thanks very much for the introduction, and I would like to thank very much the organizing committee to have invited me to share this session. So this is the last one of what's been a very interesting workshop I found so far. And this closing session is about the characterization and modeling of liquefiable soil, more or less. And I'm very lucky because most of the presenters are friends and family. So our first speaker is Andrea, Dr. Andrea Diambra, who graduated in 2010 with a PhD from the University of Bristol. And in the same year, he joined that department as staff. His original research interest was in fiber reinforced soils, and since then he's wide on his research interests. And he's now leading two large projects, one on the next generation of site investigation, and the other one trying to improve the design of offshore structures. Well, I find that constitutive modeling has always been at the core of his preoccupation when doing research, and today he's going to present us with the new hardening memory surface model for site technology. So, Andrea, unfortunately, Andrea's not with us, so it's going to be online, but this is the only online presentation in this session.
Okay, so can I just check that you can hear me and you can see my presentation?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, that's perfect. So thank you very much, Beatrice, for the very kind introduction, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the organizing committee, the TC101, Dr. Abdul Lekinci, and the Chamber of Institutes of Civil Engineering for inviting me to give this talk. And please let me know if you see if you don't see the red dot that is moving over the screen, as well as the animation of the presentation. So in the next half an hour or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-axial testing and modeling of liquefiable soil, mainly under in-cyclic behavior. But I have expanded a little bit my presentation just to give an hint about how this model and testing can be applied to offshore wind farm, especially to monopile foundation. That is a very hot topic in the United Kingdom at present. So how is my presentation structure? We start with an introduction, very, very brief, just to clarify the structure. And then we go to element testing, where we'll touch upon two main subjects, multi-axial testing and loading history. And we see that this testing in the multi-axial space and loading history touches two dimensions of testing that has been talked quite a lot this morning, that is about space, intended as direction in the stress space, but also time. So what happened to the soil over the time in terms of loading history, but also as aging, as many lecturers has already pointed out this morning. And then we'll try to unify these two concepts of space and time into constitutive modeling through the memory hardening surface ingredient that has been developed by ourselves in Bristol and now has been used a little bit more widely. And finally, we'll go to see how this new modeling technique can be implemented in foundation performance assessment, especially in a different application of what we've seen this morning, that is about earthquake mostly, but into offshore monopiles. And then we'll do some conclusion. Let's do a little bit of introduction just to clarify the structure of the presentation. We have seen that through element testing this morning, afternoon, we can actually investigate several aspects of the soil behavior. And it's a very valuable tool that we can use directly in the field. So here I have made this arrow with with the dashed, just to follow what Professor Cetin just told us with this very inspiring lecture, that we can use element testing results for liquefaction assessment in the field, but we need to do several different steps and correction. But I'm going now to another route that is basically using element testing to inform, validate, and calibrate quantitative modeling, such that we can try to capture the full stress or stress strain behavior, and then use these ingredients into the three-boundary value problem, like, for example, here in the monopiles. And this is quite a good technique because we can analyze what's happened to the structure, like in this case, the pile, but we can also expect what we expect, that is the behavior of the soil. So let's now tackle all the three boxes in the next 20-25 minutes, and to see how they can be connected and what we can learn at the end. So let's start from element testing and the multi-axial testing. So whenever we have seen this morning that typically when we study the undrained shearing of sand, we employ two types of laboratory tests that are cyclic triaxial or cyclic simple shear. But there has been a lot of discussion about the good things about these two tests, and they have to praise, but also they don't fully simulate what's happening in the field. And that was discussed by Professor Cetin before, but also by Professor Ansal this morning in these two very excellent presentation. And basically the main drawbacks of these two tests is that either we test the soil in axis symmetric condition, on plane strain condition, or also that we can only cycle typically only one stress condition, either the normal stress or either the shear stress. And the question is, what are instead the real condition in the field? And if we look at the field, and I just done collection of typical example in the literature of stress condition in the field relevant to this topic. And probably the first one was the one proposed by Sciarra, that while he was studying the wave-induced liquefaction on seabed. And Sciarra and co-workers, they pointed out that in soil element below the seabed, we have changes in both normal stresses, but also shear stresses. And remember that now here we are working on a plane strain condition. So this is a simplified 2D representation of the stress condition. And in the same plane strain simplified condition, Gu et al. Say that we have the similar change in both shear stresses and normal stresses at the same time, if we consider the S wave, MP wave on a soil element. But we have also, and I just anticipate before that, the behavior, if you consider 3D condition, is more complex than this. The work by Pesano et al. That actually is taking further the work also study what is the stress state in element below embankment. And actually they pointed out that if you take different soil elements, they are loaded in different way. And one of the important things is that actually the principal stress direction changing from place to place. So the principal stress is an important feature. But when an earthquake comes or we have some loading, this principal stress can then rotate. So now we actually are introducing, like you have seen also, we heard also this morning, about the importance of orientation and rotation of principal stress axis. I remember the difference between the orientation, that is basically the direction of the principal stress axis, and the rotation, so the change in the direction, because we'll use these two words, orientation and rotation, a little bit more later. And finally, the final example is what we've done in Bristol with Professor Ibrahim and my PhD student, Xiaoyang Cheng, to study the three-dimensional stress state around monopile. And we have now discovered that beyond orientation and rotation, we have all 6 stress components that they change into the soil element. So when we can see now that the triaxial test and the cycle simple shear test are very good apparatus. But the question is there anything more complex in our hands that we can use to basically simulate better the 6-dimensional stress space in the laboratory? And we can use, for example, the cubical cell or the bidirectional simple shear that we have seen an example just in the recent lecture, where we now can control 3 stress components. But we can actually do something more as well by going on the hollow cylinder torsional apparatus, where we can control the 4 stress components. And in the next few slides, I will basically now concentrate on the hollow cylinder apparatus. So the hollow cylinder, we have understood that in previous presentation, that is similar to a triaxial test, and now the sample, as the word say, is hollow cylindrical. The fact that it is hollow cylindrical gives us some complexity in sample preparation and in stress analysis, but a great advantage that we can apply a vertical force, a torsional force, and we can control independently the internal and external pressure. If you now look at the soil element, we then have a normal stress and a shear stress on this face, and then we have other 2 normal stresses on the perpendicular face, but also on the external face. So we have now 4 stress components. When we analyze the stress path that we apply in the hollow cylinder, we use this, typically this stress plane will become a space in just a second, where we have the deviatoric stress, so the difference between the vertical and the horizontal on the x-axis. And if you apply just a vertical force, we apply triaxial condition. If we just want to apply a torsional force, we move on this direction. And in this case, we just apply torsion, or basically shear. If we apply both, we can move in any direction here. So in short, we actually change the direction of the principal stress axis. So we can control the orientation of the principal stress axis. But if we change tau and the 2 sigma in a specific way, we can also make that reorient. So we can control the initial orientation, but also the rotation. And what is the effect of the internal external pressure? Well, we can then control the intermediate principal stress, because this plane can become a space if we then add the effect of the 4th stress component, that is the sigma r. But let's see what are the main studies on multiaxial testing. I don't want to give an exhaustive overview, but just to give an idea of how important it is to consider the multiaxial stress space. And probably the first work was those done by Ishihara and Yamazaki, where they look at the influence of loading the soil cyclically and drain in doing triaxial shear, so horizontal on the plane, or torsionally. And then you can see the typical liquefaction resistance curve that we have less resistance in triaxial compression extension than in torsion. But if we then apply circular rotational principal stress axis, we have less resistance. So you can now see that both the orientation, but also the rotational principal stress axis has a very strong influence on our liquefaction resistance. In Bristol, we have recently done a little bit more work on the influence of orientation. So instead of just testing sample on for triaxial compression, extension, and torsion, we have then imposed after the different direction. So here we just change the orientation, but we don't have applied any rotation. You can see some typical results on my right-hand side. But let's now see how the liquefaction curve they develop. So we have found that the cyclic torsional test give the highest resistance of liquefaction, and the triaxial test, as is shear, are slightly lower. But we also find that the 2 other orientation, 50 and 30 degrees, actually give lower curve. And if you see this plot on the right-hand side, you can see that for 15 degrees, for the 3 cyclic amplitude that we have applied, we have found a minimum number of cycles of our liquefaction. So we can now see that the simultaneous application of torsion and deviatoric stress in terms of difference in normal stress actually is the detrimental effect. And this probably linked with what we have heard this morning as well from Lucia Mele, where she was actually talking about these chain forces that we develop during the consolidation and how they change during the loading. And if we think that when we do isotropic compression, we create some some vertical or some linear chain forces, when that are stress under axial loading, when we apply torsional loading, we can basically break these forces. But the worst effect is actually for a specific combination of axial and torsional loading, suggesting that there is no any proportion between the resistance to liquefaction and alpha, but the behavior is highly non-linear. So orientation has an effect on our liquefaction resistance or Andrean behavior, but also the rotation of principal stress axis is very detrimental. And this is the work that is done by Sivatalayan, sorry about the pronunciation, and co-workers. They did quite a large body of work, but I just selected these results to give a little bit of an overview. And in this case, instead of changing the orientation, they made the soil the principal stress reorient between the different angles. So with an amplitude of 30 degrees and 45 degrees. They actually find, and you can see the number of cycle liquefaction versus the amplitude of this cycle, that there is a minimum. It's a very similar trend of what I've shown you before, but the results are completely different, because before we were talking about initial orientation, now we're talking about a rotation. And the worst rotation is about where the amplitude here is about 45 degrees. So we're looking now at orientation, we look at rotation, and then we are missing the third dimension that we have in multi-axial testing, that is the intermediate stress. And these I just publishing the work of Tastan and Carraro, that they look at the effect of the intermediate principal stress to the factor B, and you can see that this factor has indeed an influence on the liquefaction resistance, but probably is less than the rotation and the orientation principal stress axis. Overall, these results show that the multiaxial stress behavior is an important aspect to be considered when we look at the Andrean behavior of soil. But what we may see is that a unique framework that gives a complete description of the Andrean behavior of soil under multiaxial stress state, that probably is the only grail of our understanding, has still not developed. So further work has to be done. And I'm happy to see that people are trying to also explore more the multiaxial behavior. So we have now touched the space. Let's go quickly on the time component. I will be very, very brief with a couple of slides, just to show, for example, that the loading history prior to applying Andrean cycle is very, very important on the resistance of liquefaction and liquefaction behavior. Here I'm representing the data from Wickman et al., where you can see the Andrean behavior without any cyclic preloading, and the comparison with if we apply cycle of different amplitudes. So these are 10 cycle applied before the Andrean cyclic loading of 30 kPa and 50 kPa amplitude. And you can see the number of cycle increasing where we increase the amplitude. But also this is further increases if for the same amplitude, we increase the number of cycle. But history is not only stress history is not only the only components important, is also aging. And I don't want to go too much into this because we have seen the presentation by, again, Professor Cetin and Professor Rob Moss that gave a very exhaustive overview how important is to consider aging, so history in our liquefaction resistance. Okay, so space and time are two important components. How we can introduce them in our constitutive model. And here we need to open probably the flow with what is the challenge of constitutive modeling of the Andrean behavior of soil. And actually the big challenge you can see clearly in these two plots. Because let's divide these two plots in two phases, the pre-liquefaction and the post-liquefaction behavior. And this definition is actually taken from the paper by Young and that is working under Professor Dafalias, one of the most constitutive modeler in our discipline. So basically, you can see that in the pre-liquefaction behavior, we have a very difficult behavior to model that is like an accordion, where this cycle, they are first very spaced and then become more denser, and then they become spaced again. And we have a very stiff behavior. And all of a sudden, we actually reach the liquefaction where we can have this kind of shape that if I can, I would like to use the banana loop that I really like, the definition given before about this banana loop, the banana shape, that are actually a challenge in constitutive modeling to be reproduced. And now you can understand that when we do constitutive modeling, we cannot go. Okay, I hope there was no any problem with my screen before. I just got a message here. When we got to this kind of constitutive modeling, we need to use advanced constitutive modeling. So we need to use the resource of bounding surface or hyperplasticity model. And beyond this, we need to also add some other feature that are this measure of the memory. And this is basically done typically through some formulation in which we account for the cumulative strain. So typical model like the sunny sand or PM4 sand that are very widespread and are very well known, they actually are quite successful in modeling this behavior, but they actually try to capture this nonlinear evolution of properties that happen during the pre and post liquefaction to some accumulated strain dependent rule. In Bristol, we have recently tried to develop another procedure that is based on the memory surface concept. I have to say that this concept was basically developed initially for drain conditions, so for cyclic drain condition, to a PhD work of Riccardo Corti. But then upon challenging and after on a drain condition, we actually realized that the concept was actually very powerful. And that's led to the implementation of the same model into the sunny sand, to some collaboration with the colleagues in Delft, to give rise to the sunny sand MS, where MS stands for memory surface model. And then the same concept is even taken forward by the Falias and co-worker, developing another version of the sunny sand called sunny sand MSF, where M stands for memory and SF stands for semi-fluidized model. And I'll show you what are the advantages of using this memory surface concept in a second. But first of all, let's now really understand why we need this memory surface concept. And to do that, we need now to understand what is a bounding surface model. So here we have our typical QP' stress condition, our multi-axial stress space, sigma 1, sigma 2, sigma 3 are the three principal stresses. E P' is our volumetric plane. And let's build now a stress strain curve. A typical shearing can be drained, can be undrained, but let's now shear the soil. First of all, we need to start from our current stress condition. Let's consider we are isotropic condition. So in this plane, we are at the origin because this is an isotropic R6. And here we have a certain P and a certain density. Obviously, we don't have any shear stress. The first thing we need to do is we need to load the soil elastically. So when we start to load in the soil, we will be on a region that is governed by elastic properties. Now, these are just isotropic elasticity for just the sake of simplicity. I would like to mention that I will not give many formula here, but I like to see the modeling in a sort of geometrical way. So if we need now to build this curve, what we need the final target. And then is the critical state. Critical state tells us what is the strength we need to reach when we load. That is a line on the QP' and this type of algari shape in the multi-axial stress space, but also a final volume, typical critical state line that can be unique if we want, or some people they say is not unique, but this can vary according to some specific rules. Then we know that most of the time, we don't go straight from the initial stiffness to the final target, but we have some intermediate strength, and that is where the bounding surface is coming to play. The bounding surface is basically our measure of the current strength. So the strength we get for some specific condition. So it's basically an intermediate target that is dependent on our density, our state parameter. And the state parameter governs our strength. So we can have a function that we can multiply the strength at critical state by a function of our state parameter, such that our strength is higher than the critical state. If we are on the dense side, for example, if we are above, this can be even below the critical state line. Okay, so we have our initial stiffness, our intermediate strength, our final strength. How do we build our curve? With the fourth component of the bonding surface, that is a plastic stiffness degradation. So we need to go from this elastic stiffness up to 0, fully plastic state. And this is done in bonding surface to this distance of our point to its image on the bonding surface. The larger is this distance, the larger is the stiffness. As we go here towards this point, we reach our peak condition, then the stiffness becomes 0. And this is what this curve is saying. So such that we go to this point. But then we need to go to the final point, and this we got the fifth ingredients in any model, that is the flow rule, that tell us as you shear, your point must go to critical state, our psi becomes 0, and then our strength go to critical state in both planes, such that we have to go to the final condition. Okay, this works very well for monotonic condition. Everyone knows that it works very well for loose soil, for dense soil. What's happening if we do now these undering cycles? And this is what I want to show you. If we do some undering cycles, basically we load, unload, and then we start loading again. And every time we actually move the surface, if I go back, up and down. And every time we are almost in the same condition. And if you apply this bonding surface like it is, actually we obtain this kind of simulation here, where we have very few cycles to failure and that are very different behavior of what we have in experiment. And these are the first simulation that we did with Riccardo Corti when we were exploring the performance of very simple bonding surface model. And the fact here is that basically at every time we do the cycle, the stiffness is dependent on this distance between our stress and the image, and this distance becomes lower. So this cycle actually they become larger instead of becoming denser. So that's why in the first approach we use the cumulative strain to change the flow rule. But in this case, we want to use a geometrical approach. And the geometrical approach is actually to introduce this concept of the memory surface. And the memory surface is a very simple concept. If we have been somewhere, we have a region that we must remember where our response of the soil is stiffer. And this is basically translated in a very simple equation. I don't want you to understand this equation. I want just to let you know that this hardening modulus is proportional to the stiffness. And we have an additional term where that basically is exponential because it becomes 1 when we are at this point, such that basically the memory surface given a stiffer response only when we are inside. And we have only one model parameters here, that is this, that tell us how much is stiffer the soil when we are inside the memory surface compared to where we are on the boundaries. Okay, so we have one model parameter, but how is this memory surface moving? How is evolving during loading? And here we now can look at that in the multi-axial stress space. So let's consider some initial condition. We have a memory surface, so this is the stress state in which we have been, and then we have our stress state, and then we have our ill locus. If we go outside, we actually go somewhere we have never been. So the memory surface must expand. You can now see that the expansion is a purely geometrical mechanism. So there is no any other model parameters involved. What's happening if we keep going? If we keep going, at a certain point, we reach a state in which the soil lose or break is a fabric, probably issuing a large strain. And this is the metaphor of life. The more you travel, the more you forget what you have done in the past. The more you get old, the more you forget what you have done when you were a child. So we must have a mechanism that when we go close to failure or close to the peak condition, actually the memory surface lose memory and shrinks. And this is, we need another model parameters. I have to say that these model parameters doesn't need to be calibrated because it often takes some specific value. And you can now understand that actually this memory surface somehow is a measure of fabric where the size give an idea of the, let's say between brackets, a strength of the fabric, if we can call it strength, and its position give an idea of the anisotropy of the fabric. So what's happened now when instead we move inside the memory surface? When we move inside the memory surface, every time we are somehow strengthen this chain probably. So we need actually the memory surface to get bigger. This is similar when you travel to the same place a few times. The more times you travel, the better you know the way, the faster you are. And every time you reach a destination, you look a little bit further out, so you know better what's happening around. And if you do your cyclic quite a few times, your memory surface becomes actually larger. So that the more you cycle, the more the soil is stiffer. And if you apply this simple rule with these two parameters, where only one needs to be calibrated, we can get this kind of behavior. You can now see this that we get in the comparison between simulation and experiments, this kind of accordion trend where we have the cycle getting denser and then all in a sudden getting more space until we go to the stability. These are some simulation from the Sunny-Sand MS application, but I show you some simulation also from the Sunny-Sand MSF application. And in this paper by the Fales co-workers, there is written very clearly what is the advantage of using this memory surface model. Because when we do the test, basically we start the test on drain, we start to build our memory surface, and as we cycle, we build the memory surface bigger and bigger. So our behavior becomes stiffer. But there is a point in which we go to the stability line that basically we have this disappearing of the memory surface, such that then we can have an additional formulation, that's why it's SF, that enable us to capture the behavior of post-liquefaction and to get this typical banana shapes loop. So you can see that now having this geometrical ingredient, we can actually have a measure, a feature that enable us to capture the pre-liquefaction behavior and to have formulation based on accumulated strain or other variable that actually enable us to fully capture the post-liquefaction behavior. So the real advantage is the decoupling of the pre and the post-liquefaction with a mechanism that at the stability point is basically disappearing. Just very quickly, I would like to show what are the other advantages of the memory surface. Actually, this is the simulation of the same data I showed you before with cyclic preloading. The more we do cyclic preloading, the larger is the memory surface before we start the undrain cycle. So the more cycle to liquefaction, and this is due because we start with the stiffer soil, and the same properties actually can be applied both to cyclic preloading but also to aging. You can see the fit between the pore water pressure accumulated with the number of cycle and the number of liquefaction to cycle liquefaction for different pre-amplitude. We have the test. The model has been also tested for different multiaxial conditions. So here are the simulation on the Sunny-Sand MS for the torsional test and cyclic triaxial test. So good agreement, but there is something still missing in the literature. That is basically the investigation of different orientation and rotation of principal stress axis between triaxial compression and torsion. And I have to say that I'm not sure that the model itself in this formulation can really capture what, for example, we have seen before, that was the nonlinear effect of the orientation of the principal stress axis. And probably there are other mechanisms that needs to be better tuned in order to have a model that is fully capture the multiaxial behavior. So further work, I believe, needs to be done in this direction. But let's see now how this model and the current condition can be used in some application. And I've chosen the offshore wind turbine application because this is a very hot topic in the UK and I think all over the world, because offshore wind will be one of the big helpers, especially in the north part of the hemisphere where the climate is a little colder, actually to decrease the to decrease our need for energy. So these offshore wind turbine are basically typically funded on monopiles. Monopiles is the 90% selective foundation of for this wind turbine, and the driving design criteria is the ice behavior during cyclic loading. Cyclic loading due to the wave and the wind. So during the storm, this monopile is subjected to a very large number of cycles of lateral loading. Now, the design of this monopile is recently based on FE. And why? Because these monopiles are actually very, very large. We are now reaching diameters, if you want to picture the size, of about 10 to 12 meters. So they're very large monopiles. And the length of these monopiles can reach about easily 100 meters because they are typically installed for 30, 40 meters. And let's consider we have 40, 50 meters of water depth. So it's not unusual we get 90 meters monopile. And you can understand the challenge in moving this monopile with the cranes, but also in installing, because driving the monopiles down in the soil is actually a big challenge. So any design optimization is actually very, very welcome. And that's why final element is actually used to analyze this maybe rather simple boundary problem. We use the FE either to determine PY curve, or now FE is basically used to design directly monopile. So the other aspect we need to think is, what is the loading condition during a storm? These waves, they have typically a period of less than 10 seconds, and the wind, they excite the blades, and the rotation of this blade is very fast. So the cyclic loading is actually very low period, and it's actually not unusual that we have pore pressure build up in the soil. So that's why a model that can actually predict very well the pore pressure generation, even in sand, is needed here. And some initial work was done by Liu in Kenya that used the sunny sand MS to show what is the difference between the pile behavior if we use undrained and drain condition. And you can see the very different behavior of the pile because of the pore pressure buildup generated during the cyclic loading. And these were 10 cycles. We have to say that the storm may last, for example, 20, 30 hours. So it may be the sun cycle that trigger some undrained condition, but then the pore water can dissipate. So actually the real behavior is somewhere in the middle, where we have to do some further work, and this is done in the literature on partially drained condition. Just to let you understand, these are some stress paths that are extracted for soil element around the pile in the same paper. And you can see how we have a pre-liquefaction behavior and then going to liquefaction. And again, here for sample D that is a little bit further down, so less loaded. These trends they are not very linear because we are missing a dimension here. Remember, the stress state here is 6 dimensions, so the load angle may change during the loading. So that's why this is not they are not linear. On the other hand, if you consider partially drained condition, we have a pore pressure build-up that then is dissipated. So in the partial drained condition, we expect this part of the curve to be much more important probably than this part for several conditions. I have touched now on the load angle because if we now inspect this element and we look which stress conditions are triggered, we have change in both normal stresses and shear stresses. And this actually linked very well with the work that we have done recently in Bristol, and where we have taken a monopile and we have analyzed the stress path of several elements around the monopile. In front of the monopile, all around, on the back, and for each element, we have extracted the stress path, and we have given some recommendation for hollow cylinder or other type of testing to be used in our laboratory testing to calibrate the constitutive model. And this is some work that is been only partially published, but we'll publish more widely very soon. And you can see, for example, for this element here, EF1, the best condition is basically to do a hollow cylinder test that is cycling at an initial condition that is not isotropic and then at a certain orientation. And this may be, this brings me to the end of my presentation, where actually this, if you remember the structure, we went from element testing to modeling to 3D FE. But probably the real value here is actually to come back, where we can use FE to inform again what we are doing in our element testing, such that this becomes a closed loop, and overall we can reach some convergence and probably some optimization of the overall design. And yeah, and this is the end of my presentation. So we have discussed the importance of stress, space, and time for governing the behavior of soil. We have identified the multiaxial behavior of soil, both in experimental, but maybe even in modeling has not been fully unraveled. And we have also discussed this memory surface modeling technique that is probably a simple geometrical way to track what's happened in space and time. And we apply this to the offshore monopiles, where actually there is further scope for research, looking at the partially drained condition and how that can affect the pile behavior. And that can also give some idea for some element testing, but also can actually we use the FE to improve our multi-axial testing strategy technique, and can we improve our prediction with more multi-axial testing and modeling. So, and these are the references, but I would like to finish my presentation acknowledging the contribution and the work that I've done together with my colleagues, and also thanking again all the organizing committee for inviting me to deliver this lecture. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andreas. Very nice to see a robust approach like bonding surface plasticity, adapted to cyclic loading. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. I'm conscious I'm in the last session, and therefore we don't want to be too late, but please, if you have any question for Andrea, now, otherwise we have a Q&A session just after the next speakers, and so please, Andrea, if you stay online, maybe some more questions will come.